Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when eating a carrot or, for that matter, almost any other humble vegetable could feel suspiciously like a political act. But before we start, make sure your lights are dim, your blankets are cozy, and your phone is comfortably ignored for the next hour and a half. Oh, and if you enjoy wandering through the oddly tragic and surprisingly petty world of medieval agriculture, hit that subscribe button. It's a quiet way of joining us on this gentle, meandering journey. Now, let's settle in and imagine ourselves in a Europe that, in many ways, seems only slightly more forgiving than a dietitian who insists you absolutely cannot have cake. Imagine stone castles, rolling fields, and peasants nervously clutching cabbages while monks fuss over their medicinal herb gardens. Agriculture, in theory, should have been simple. Plant a seed, water it, harvest it. In practice, it was an almost theatrical exercise in fear, superstition, and very selective taste. Because, of course, some vegetables were quietly accused of being dangerous, not poisonous in the chemical sense, though sometimes they were, but morally, socially, or even spiritually threatening. They were, in essence, banned, not officially by law in most cases, but by custom, rumor, and a heavy-handed church that insisted some things were better left untouched, and if you ate them, well, you might be inviting deformity, misfortune, or, more commonly, suspicion. Take, for instance, the humble parsnip. It looks innocent enough, resembling a pale, elongated carrot with a mild sweet flavor. But in medieval Europe, the parsnip had a reputation that was almost comically sinister. Some believed it could cause infertility. Others thought it might interfere with your spiritual balance, because apparently the line between nutrition and sorcery was a thin, easily crossed route. In monasteries, nuns were sometimes forbidden from planting parsnips near the convent gardens. They were convinced that the parsnip, while nourishing, carried with it a whisper of temptations, something that could disrupt the holy calm of celibate life. Similarly, the onion, which we might now consider a harmless kitchen staple, had its moments of scandal. In certain periods, it was considered too stimulating, too provocative. Eating onions was said to provoke inappropriate desires, or at least, it was assumed that anyone consuming them too enthusiastically might suddenly begin to harbor thoughts unbecoming a devout individual. Naturally, they made it worse. Onion cultivation could be restricted around religious sites, and anyone growing them excessively might be subtly shunned at the local market. Let's drift over to the cabbage, a vegetable so ordinary today that imagining fear around it feels slightly absurd. Yet in the late medieval period, some regions considered cabbages risky for pregnant women. Superstitious midwives would caution against overindulgence, warning that cabbage could result in weak or malformed infants. The cabbage, in its humble green majesty, became a scapegoat for all sorts of natural misfortunes. Because, of course, it is always easier to blame a leafy vegetable than to examine prenatal care or lack thereof. Beans were no exception to suspicion. Broad beans in particular were viewed as somewhat morally ambiguous. Some monastic orders restricted their consumption during fasting periods, claiming that they stirred lustful thoughts. Others believed that eating beans could summon spirits or even cause physical deformities. This belief was taken seriously enough that local ordinances in certain Italian towns might forbid the sale of beans during holy festivals. The vegetable, innocent in flavor, became a tiny, crunchy battleground between superstition and daily life. Then there was garlic, which today we praise for its culinary virtues and supposed medicinal benefits. But in some medieval texts, garlic is described as a vegetable best avoided by the devout. Monks feared that garlic heightened human passion, distracted from prayer, and, in extreme cases, invited the devil into one's bloodstream. Of course, garlic was also used to ward off spirits, so its reputation was oddly dual, simultaneously protective and dangerous, sacred and profane. One might imagine a nun quietly peeling cloves in the dark, half in fear and half in devotion. Moving eastward, turnips were another source of subtle panic. Thought to be healthy but heavy on the digestive system, turnips were sometimes restricted for children and pregnant women. Some believed that the vegetable, when eaten too often, could cloud the mind or dull the senses. There is a record, faint but persistent, of a minor noblewoman being scolded for serving too many turnips at a feast. Naturally, this resulted in her experiencing mild embarrassment and a lasting association between social awkwardness and root vegetables. Leeks, which might seem perfectly benign today, were occasionally treated with suspicion due to their association with bodily humors. The medieval medical system believed in a delicate balance of heat, cold, dryness, and moisture in the body. Leeks, being warming in nature, were thought to imbalance this system if eaten excessively. Excessive leeks could, according to one slightly alarming pamphlet, awaken desires that should sleep. Peas were yet another culinary tightrope. While peas were generally allowed, certain varieties were considered unsafe if they were not fully ripe. Consuming them too early was thought to bring on weakness or disease. Worse, in the imagination of a particularly paranoid herbalist, underripe peas could cause misfortune in childbirth or lead to mild but socially embarrassing twitching. This gave rise to cautious gardening practices that might seem excessive to modern eyes, but were entirely logical within a worldview governed by spiritual and physical balance. Interestingly, some of these fears persisted even in the kitchen. Sauces, stews, and preserved vegetables could all carry suspicion. Pickling a cucumber, for instance, was not always considered neutral. The act of fermenting, with its smells and unexpected chemical transformations, sometimes led superstitious cooks to believe that evil spirits could linger in the jar. So, for the more anxious housewives, it was safer to avoid certain pickled vegetables entirely, or at least to whisper prayers over them while working. We should also note that not all bans were spiritual. Some were outright economic or political. For instance, certain vegetables were taxed heavily because they were easy to grow, abundant, and therefore threatening to aristocratic food markets. A cabbage or a carrot that costs next to nothing could undermine a market. Lord S. carefully maintained sense of scarcity. In these cases, banning or at least discouraging the vegetable was less about morality and more about maintaining social control and profit margins. One might picture a minor noble pacing in the sunlight, grumbling about the audacity of carrots to grow so cheaply in peasants' gardens. Then, of course, there were vegetables that straddled both the moral and economic lines. Spinach, with its mysterious leaves and somewhat magical appearance, was sometimes thought to cause mild madness if consumed in excess. Coupled with the fact that it was relatively easy to grow in small home gardens, this meant that local authorities occasionally advised caution or, at least a gentle nod of approval for moderation. Spinach, it seems, was both nourishing and vaguely suspect, a common theme among these medieval vegetables. By now, you might be wondering if anything was truly safe. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, and tomatoes had not yet arrived in Europe, leaving locals to fret over the plants that had lettuce, surprisingly, escaped much of this scrutiny, perhaps because it was mild, bland, and largely inconsequential. One could eat it with minimal fear of social or spiritual repercussions, which may explain its eventual dominance in European gardens. But everything else, carrots, parsnips, onions, beans, garlic, cabbages, turnips, leeks, peas, and spinach was susceptible to suspicion. And of course, these prohibitions were enforced, not with armies or decrees in most cases, but through gentle social pressure, rumor, and the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors, priests, and mothers-in-law. The result was a subtle, pervasive anxiety around vegetables. Something as mundane as dinner could become a quiet moral trial. Children were warned, adults were admonished, and the humble gardener sometimes had to cultivate both crops and courage. In hindsight, this almost seems absurd. We look at a carrot and see a simple, sweet root. But in the context of medieval Europe, a carrot could embody temptation, a threat to health, and a minor scandal. Each vegetable carried stories of fear, prudence, and superstition. And yet, life continued. People ate cautiously, gardened carefully, and somehow survived these leafy moral dilemmas. The medieval obsession with banning or restricting vegetables reminds us of a broader truth, that even the most ordinary aspects of life can become sources of worry when viewed through the lens of fear and authority. And while some of these beliefs seem quaint or absurd today, They shaped the rhythms of daily life, influencing what people planted, what they ate, and even how they thought about their bodies. So, as you slowly relax tonight, consider the humble parsnip, the cautious cabbage, and the slightly scandalous onion. These were not merely foods, they were small actors in a quiet, medieval drama of superstition, morality, and social control. And somewhere in a monastery garden, a nun may have sighed over her forbidden vegetables, pondering whether the leafy green she held might tempt her soul or simply make her dinner a touch more interesting. And with that, we'll pause here, drifting gently from one garden of concern to the next. Tomorrow or the next part we'll continue our exploration, moving into some of the stranger, more unfortunate cases of vegetables blamed for deformity, infertility, and divine displeasure. Because of course, even plants could be guilty of mischief in the Middle Ages. Welcome back, friends. As you settle deeper into your blankets, imagine yourself strolling through the slightly overgrown gardens of a medieval estate, where each plant carries a story far weightier than its roots or leaves might suggest. Tonight, we'll drift through the world of vegetables that were blamed for misfortune, deformity, and a variety of inconveniences far beyond their humble abilities. It's a quiet, oddly tragic spectacle, and perfectly suited for a calm evening. After our last wander among cautious cabbages, suspicious onions, and morally ambiguous parsnips, we can now explore the vegetables that truly carried a reputation for trouble. These were not merely questionable plants, they were the scapegoats of medieval superstition, the silent witnesses to misfortune, and sometimes the imagined agents of divine wrath. Let's begin with the cucumber. Today, it is bland, refreshing, and thoroughly innocuous. In the Middle Ages, it carried whispers of calamity. Some herbalists and midwives believed that cucumbers could induce deformities in children if consumed at the wrong time, particularly by pregnant women. It's difficult to imagine a tiny green cylinder wielding such power, but medieval logic often relied more on analogy than science. The cucumber's long, narrow shape was thought to influence the unborn child, which is, in hindsight, both mildly alarming and rather inventive. Carrots, which we now consider essential for vision and kitchen staples, also fell under suspicion. The orange carrot, a relatively recent cultivation in medieval Europe, was thought in some texts to cause eye problems when eaten excessively. Additionally, carrots were associated with fertility issues, which, naturally, made them suspect in households concerned with lineage and heirs. Nobles, particularly those obsessed with bloodlines, often avoided carrots at crucial moments, as if the shape and color of the vegetable could somehow interfere with the miracle of conception. Spinach, we've already met, but its story grows darker here. Overconsumption of spinach was sometimes blamed for madness, physical weakness, or moral laxity. Imagine a monk slowly stirring a pot of creamy spinach, sighing quietly at the possibility that the meal could undermine his lifelong vows of restraint. Spinach, in its innocent green guise, carried the heavy burden of suspicion. Turnips, too, took on a more sinister reputation. Certain communities feared that eating turnips during particular months could result in weak or malformed offspring. Children were carefully rationed, and midwives often scolded mothers for what they called turnip folly. It's a gentle reminder that even in a world dominated by superstition, vegetables were treated as small actors in the grand theater of life and death. Beans, broad, green, and otherwise unremarkable, were often considered dangerous to pregnant women. Some sources claimed that eating beans could twist the fetus into unusual positions or even alter its form. This belief led to careful meal planning and frequent warnings from neighbors. A household could be judged by its bean consumption, a slightly tragic notion, since beans are otherwise entirely harmless. And then there were more exotic accusations. In some regions, leeks were thought to exacerbate moral weakness in women, while garlic, despite its spiritual protective qualities, could supposedly stir up physical passions. It's a curious paradox. A vegetable might be simultaneously protective and hazardous, a culinary duality that left even the most careful cook slightly uneasy. Cabbage, once again, deserves mention. By this point, it had a particularly bad reputation among midwives. Some believed it caused deformities in infants if consumed excessively by pregnant women. Others thought it might dull the intellect or bring on spiritual lethargy. It's perhaps the most dramatic example of a vegetable quietly bearing the blame for all sorts of life's unfortunate outcomes. Moving to beans again, we find the fava bean, which in some communities was considered capable of inducing minor illnesses. While modern science has identified certain chemical sensitivities in fava beans for rare individuals, medieval fear amplified this into universal threat. It became a symbol of the precarious line between sustenance and danger, between ordinary nourishment and imagined calamity. The humble radish also enters this gallery of misfortune. Sharp, pungent, and often consumed raw, radishes were sometimes believed to stimulate improper desires or worsen pre-existing ailments. Pregnant women were particularly warned against them, because their strong flavor was thought to correlate with an overly active temperament in the unborn child. Imagine a quiet kitchen, a mother slicing radishes, feeling a mixture of culinary satisfaction and moral anxiety is seen repeated in countless households across Europe. It's interesting to note that these vegetable suspicions often overlapped with the medieval theory of the four humors. Foods were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and imbalances could supposedly lead to physical, emotional, or spiritual disorders. A carrot might be hot, a cabbage cold, and garlic fiery. Combine the wrong flavors at the wrong times, and you risked a minor catastrophe or at least a mild lecture from the village herbalist. Of course, some vegetables bore reputations shaped more by societal control than biology. Restrictions on broad beans and garlic were sometimes tools for enforcing fasting, modesty, or other religious observances. It was easier to convince someone to skip a vegetable than to rewrite the rigid rules of holy conduct. Food became an instrument of moral instruction, subtly reminding citizens of their place in the divine order. Peas, as mild as they seem today, were occasionally included in this list of morally or spiritually risky vegetables, particularly in certain Italian regions. Peas were thought to weaken the body if consumed excessively during particular seasons. Some manuscripts describe peas as potentially softening the resolve, an odd but consistent concern in a world obsessed with spiritual and physical discipline. Spinach returns once more, this time noted for its supposed role in both deformity and madness. Overconsumption was feared not merely for physical effects, but for the way it might influence temperament and judgment. Imagine a small medieval study where a scholar stares at a bowl of leaves, pondering their moral and intellectual consequences. Quiet, gentle anxiety surrounding something most of us would consider perfectly ordinary. Cabbages, turnips, parsnips, onions, garlic, beans, peas, radishes, cucumbers, carrots, leeks, spinach. The list grows almost endless. Each vegetable, depending on region, season, and social context, carried a story of potential misfortune. They were blamed for deformities, fertility issues, spiritual lapses, and social embarrassment. In essence, these plants became tiny, moral, and physical tests. Eating one was not merely a matter of nutrition, it was a negotiation with fear itself. And yet, life continued. People gardened, cooked, and ate, carefully balancing the advice of midwives, herbalists, and neighbors. Children were often fed cautiously, adults were instructed gently, and nuns or monks might avoid certain vegetables to preserve their spiritual equilibrium. The fear was never dramatic or loud. It was subtle, pervasive, and quietly influential. In retrospect, it's almost comical. We now see a radish and think, sure, that's fine. But in medieval Europe, that same radish could occupy the same space in someone's mind as a moral dilemma, a health warning, and a spiritual trial all at once. These vegetables, ordinary in shape and flavor, carried weight far beyond their culinary importance. They were, in a very real sense, the tiny, silent actors in a drama of superstition and prudence. And so, as you sink further into the gentle rhythm of your evening, imagine these vegetables quietly standing in the gardens of medieval estates, watched over by wary hands, whispered warnings, and careful eyes. They are both innocent and guilty, nourishing yet suspect, humble yet strangely consequential. Next, we will drift into the curious cases where entire communities prohibited certain vegetables outright, sometimes for health, sometimes for moral reasons, and sometimes simply because one minor noblewoman claimed that the parsnips looked unseemly, because, naturally, human imagination and authority combined to make the ordinary extraordinary. For now, let the image linger. Cucumbers, carrots, cabbages, beans, and radishes all quietly performing their minor acts of domestic drama. They exist in the garden, in the kitchen, and in the mind of anyone who has ever worried that dinner might somehow betray them. In the world of medieval Europe, this was serious business. Tonight, it is simply a story to carry you into calm reflection as the night drifts gently onward. Welcome back, dear listener. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your blankets and the world outside seems distant and slow, let's drift into the slightly absurd, yet oddly meticulous world of medieval vegetable enforcement. Imagine cloistered monasteries, quiet convent gardens, and noble estates, all obsessed with regulating what was considered safe or dangerous to eat. Monks and nuns, of course, were at the forefront of this quietly tyrannical oversight. Their lives were regimented, disciplined, and deliberately ascetic. The spiritual life demanded attentiveness to even the smallest detail, including the contents of a dinner plate. In some convents, certain vegetables were considered dangerous, not because they were poisonous, but because they were morally or spiritually provocative. A parsnip, for example, might be set aside, not for nourishment, but as a test of obedience and restraint. The novice who consumed it without permission risked a gentle lecture or a sigh from the abbess. Cabbage, again, held a complicated position. In one small convent in northern France, historical records suggest that it was forbidden to eat cabbage in certain months, particularly those associated with fertility or spiritual reflection. Why? Because the cabbage's cold nature, according to humoral theory, could dull spiritual sensitivity and disturb the carefully balanced temperament of a devout woman. Imagine a nun quietly peering at her cabbage soup, calculating whether a spoonful might compromise her vows. The tension is subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Garlic, which we tend to associate with robust flavor and modern culinary comfort, was treated with suspicion. Some monastic rules forbid excessive consumption, not out of fear of health issues, but because garlic could allegedly stir passions or distract from prayer. There are accounts of monks quietly sniffing their meals, wondering if one extra clove might induce a slight moral misstep. The idea is quaint and absurd to us, yet entirely plausible in the rhythms of medieval life, where every action carried symbolic weight. Beans were another frequent subject of regulation. Broad beans, fava beans, and other legumes were sometimes forbidden on fasting days. Their ease of cultivation and relative abundance meant that peasants could grow them in small plots, but in monasteries and noble kitchens, they were measured and rationed carefully. Some regulations suggested that beans could provoke flatulence, which, amusingly, was considered a moral as well as a social concern. One might imagine the quiet embarrassment in a refectory when someone broke this delicate rule. Interestingly, some communities created elaborate garden layouts to ensure that forbidden vegetables were physically separated from approved crops. Turnips might be planted on the far edge of a garden, behind hedges, or in areas marked by stones to indicate caution. This was not simply about gardening aesthetics, it was about reinforcing the subtle moral and spiritual hierarchy embedded in daily life. A novice, seeing the turnips tucked away, might pause, reflect, and carefully obey the unwritten rules. Cucumbers were another vegetable subject to oversight. In certain Italian towns, cucumbers were discouraged among pregnant women, particularly during certain months of the year. The rationale, of course, had little to do with science and everything to do with symbolism and superstition, yet enforcement was surprisingly diligent. Midwives instructed expectant mothers, family members whispered warnings, and garden placement was sometimes adjusted to reduce temptation. The cucumber became both a dietary consideration and a minor moral test. Peas, radishes, and leeks were likewise carefully monitored. Excess consumption could result in admonishment, not by a stern lawmaker, but by a quiet network of social oversight. mothers, neighbors, and spiritual guides all played a part. Meals were subtly observed, portion sizes were noted. The smallest leaf could carry weight far beyond its nutritional content. Life, in this sense, was a delicate negotiation with both plants and people. Sometimes the bans were codified, if not in law, then in careful, almost obsessive manuscript notes. Monastic rules might specify that certain vegetables could be consumed only on specific days, or only in precise quantities. Even then, enforcement was gentle, relying on subtle social pressure and moral expectation rather than punishment. A novice might be reminded that consuming too much cabbage could dull the senses, or that parsnips were best avoided during certain seasons. The tone was quiet, almost whispering, rather than commanding or dramatic. Of course, nobles had their own versions of these restrictions. In a particularly meticulous 15th century estate, household cooks were instructed on the dangers of various vegetables, who could eat them, when, and in what amounts. Meals were not merely about sustenance or taste. They were a reflection of social order, moral propriety, and, sometimes, aesthetic consideration. The right vegetable in the wrong hand or at the wrong time could upset both digestion and decorum. Interestingly, some of these rules had unintended social consequences. A household member who obeyed all vegetable restrictions might be seen as virtuous and diligent. Conversely, overindulgence could provoke gentle scolding or subtle gossip. In this way, vegetables were not only food, they were instruments of social cohesion, moral instruction, and quiet peer pressure. A radish, eaten too boldly, might quietly alter one's reputation. A cabbage, consumed with caution, could signal obedience and prudence. Let us also consider the ritual aspect. Some vegetables were linked to holy days or seasonal observances. On certain feast days, a forbidden vegetable might be consumed as part of a sanctioned ritual, symbolizing humility or penance. This added a layer of complexity to an already intricate relationship between humans and plants. The ordinary became extraordinary, the mundane became morally loaded, and the kitchen became a theater of subtle ritual performance. Garlic, again, illustrates this beautifully. Protective in some contexts, dangerous in others, it might be allowed during specific seasons, or entirely prohibited during others, depending on the spiritual calendar. Monks and nuns became adept at navigating this complex landscape. The very act of cooking and eating demanded attention, reflection, and careful moral calculation. It was as much about spiritual vigilance as it was about physical nourishment. Turnips, parsnips, and onions, meanwhile, continued to occupy a curious liminal space. They were everyday staples, yet each carried its whisper of danger. Imagine a convent garden at dawn. Dew on the leaves, a novice carefully tending her rows, thinking not merely about growth and harvest, but about obedience and propriety. These vegetables, in their silent green dignity, were both companions and tests, and yet life moved on. The sun rose and set, meals were prepared, and communities persisted in their quiet, cautious coexistence with plants. Children grew up with the gentle hum of vegetable warnings in the background. Adults navigated the intricate rules with patience, and somewhere in the gardens, leaves shimmered in morning light, completely unaware of their moral and social weight. So tonight, as you drift further towards sleep, imagine these gardens under watchful eyes. Picture the careful placement of cabbages, the distant whisper of turnip caution, the subtle warnings about beans and garlic. Each vegetable, seemingly ordinary, carries a story of quiet oversight, gentle restriction, and human imagination. In the next part, we will explore the rare cases where a vegetable ban became a community-wide obsession, outright prohibition, local ordinances, and the curious ways fear of plants shaped entire villages. Because naturally, when humans fear something as harmless as a radish, remarkable rules can follow. Welcome back, friends. Tonight, as the world outside grows quiet and your blankets feel a little heavier, let us explore the peculiar world of medieval communities, where certain vegetables were not merely suspect, they were outright forbidden. Yes, entire towns, villages, or even estates sometimes imposed bans, turning the humble carrot, turnip, or parsnip into a symbol of caution, control, and occasionally, panic. It's worth remembering that these bans were rarely dramatic in the sense of armed guards or public executions. Instead, enforcement relied on quiet social pressure, moral expectation, and the subtle power of tradition. A vegetable could be dangerous, not because it was poisonous, but because it represented risk, spiritual, moral, or social, and communities, ever careful to preserve both order and propriety, sometimes went so far as to declare a vegetable entirely off limits. Take, for instance, certain towns in northern Italy. Historical accounts suggest that broad beans were forbidden during particular festivals or holy seasons. The rationale varied. Some claimed that beans could provoke flatulence, a minor moral faux pas in polite company. Others insisted that beans were too stimulating for devout individuals, particularly young women or the unmarried. It's hard not to smile at the notion of an entire community negotiating its moral equilibrium through legumes, yet it was taken quite seriously. Parsnips, which we have already encountered as morally ambiguous and suspicious, were sometimes banned outright. In certain regions, particularly among conservative religious communities, parsnips were considered too tempting for women and children. Eating them was thought to induce restlessness or desire, subtly undermining the careful discipline that governed daily life. A village ordinance might quietly discourage planting them, while elders reminded families that moderation or complete abstinence was a virtue. Garlic, paradoxically both protective and dangerous, sometimes faced restrictions in the cloistered kitchens of convents. Too much garlic, according to spiritual guides, could excite passions and disturb prayerful contemplation. It could also, in rare cases, be seen as offensive to visitors, disrupting the social harmony of a household or monastery. And so, in some communities, garlic was permitted only in small amounts, during designated days, or under the vigilant gaze of a senior monk or abbess. Cabbage, beloved yet controversial, occasionally became the focus of community-wide concern. Certain French villages recorded temporary bans on excessive cabbage consumption during periods thought to coincide with conception or childbirth. The cabbage, in these instances, symbolized a larger anxiety about fertility, morality, and the proper order of life. It is perhaps the most dramatic example of a vegetable quietly dictating social behavior. Sometimes, the bans were reinforced through ritualized caution. Communities might hold feasts in which only approved vegetables were served, using the event as both a moral lesson and a subtle reminder of obedience. One can imagine villagers sitting quietly, eyeing the carefully curated dishes, conscious of the social and spiritual rules guiding each leaf and root. Even an accidental nibble of a forbidden plant could result in a whispered admonition, a knowing glance, or the mild social consequences of being considered imprudent. Interestingly, these prohibitions were not always religious in nature. Some were economic. In regions where certain vegetables were abundant and could threaten market prices, local authorities might quietly discourage their cultivation or sale. A carrot, too cheap and plentiful, could undermine aristocratic or merchant interests, and so, the vegetable became a tool of subtle economic control, its ban less about morality and more about maintaining social hierarchy. Leeks, which we have seen as morally ambiguous due to their humoral properties, were occasionally restricted to prevent overindulgence, particularly in noble estates. Meal planners were instructed to ration leeks carefully, noting that excess could lead to restlessness, ill humor, or even minor quarrels. The act of dining became a performance of discipline, where each bite was an exercise in social and spiritual mindfulness. Peas, radishes, cucumbers, and turnips also found themselves under scrutiny, often in overlapping ways. A turnip that was forbidden in one village for moral reasons might be restricted in another for spiritual or medicinal concerns. Peas could be temporarily banned during holy seasons. Radishes might be avoided during pregnancy. Cucumbers, as we've seen, carried fears of deformity, and so, a household or village diet became an intricate dance of caution, superstition, and prudence. The enforcement of these bans was delicate. Unlike modern laws, which rely on codified penalties, medieval vegetable restrictions often depended on social memory, community gossip, and gentle guidance from moral authorities. A mother might remind her children, a midwife might advise her patient, a priest might subtly signal that a certain vegetable was best avoided. In these quiet ways, the community collectively shaped behavior, using fear of plants as a tool for maintaining social cohesion. In some cases, the bans lasted only a season, or were specific to particular events. A temporary prohibition might accompany a drought, a disease outbreak, or a religious festival. The vegetable itself was not inherently dangerous. Rather, it was associated with a moment of potential imbalance or misfortune. And yet, the effect was real. Communities adjusted planting, harvest, and consumption patterns in response. Even the most ordinary foods became symbols of vigilance and care. There are accounts of entire marketplaces adjusting their produce displays based on these perceived dangers. Vendors might hide cucumbers behind other vegetables, avoid prominently displaying parsnips, or limit cabbage sales during sensitive periods. Shoppers would select carefully, mindful of not only taste and nutrition, but also propriety, health, and spiritual alignment. Every meal became an exercise in cautious negotiation with both community norms and unseen forces. And of course, the story is not without quiet humor. Imagine a village elder, carefully inspecting the turnip patch, murmuring about fertility or temperament, while the rest of the community tiptoes around with polite deference. Or a monk, meticulously portioning garlic for a communal feast, aware that one clove too many could disrupt moral equilibrium. These moments were gentle, understated, and entirely ordinary within the rhythms of medieval life. Yet, the broader lesson is subtle. Vegetables, despite their simplicity, were powerful symbols in medieval Europe. They could provoke fear, inspire caution, and structure entire social and spiritual practices. They reminded people that even the smallest elements of life, roots, leaves, and stems might carry consequences beyond their immediate appearance. In this, there is both charm and melancholy, the ordinary transformed into the extraordinary through human imagination, belief, and social pressure. So tonight, as you sink further into drowsiness, picture these communities quietly negotiating their gardens and meals. Carrots, parsnips, turnips, garlic, leeks, peas, radishes, cucumbers, and cabbages, each one under watchful eyes, each one quietly dictating behavior, each one a minor actor in the vast and gentle drama of medieval life. They are, in essence, reminders of how human imagination and social caution can make even the most mundane object seem significant, worthy of attention, and, in some cases, forbidden. In the next part, we will drift toward the most unusual and tragic consequences of vegetable bans, those instances where fear and superstition intersected with medicine, pregnancy, and morality, creating quietly dramatic, sometimes absurd, stories of everyday medieval life. Because, naturally, the humble turnip and cabbage could inspire more anxiety than one might expect. Welcome back, friends. As you tuck further into your blankets and the world outside fades into quiet shadows, let's drift into the slightly tragic, slightly absurd, yet entirely fascinating world of the consequences of vegetable bans. Here, in medieval Europe, even something as simple as a carrot or cabbage could inspire worry, moral reflection, and occasional minor calamity. Consider the plight of pregnant women. In a time before modern medical knowledge, vegetables were sometimes blamed for deformities or miscarriages. A woman might avoid parsnips, beans, or turnips at the advice of a midwife or even her mother, lest her child be born weak, twisted, or somehow morally compromised. Imagine the quiet tension in a kitchen as the expectant mother stirs a pot of soup, mindful that the inclusion of one forbidden root could, in theory, affect not just the health of her child, but her spiritual well-being. Cabbage, as we've seen, often bore the brunt of this fear. Midwives whispered warnings about excessive consumption, linking it to infant deformity or feeble temperament. Families, naturally, took this advice seriously, especially in communities where lineage and inheritance were paramount. One can picture a noblewoman delicately portioning her meals, balancing nourishment with caution, and wondering if a single leaf might tip the scales toward misfortune. Garlic, too, continued its paradoxical existence. Protective in some contexts, dangerous in others, it was sometimes blamed for excess passion or distraction during pregnancy. Monks and nuns might avoid it entirely, while the people were advised to consume it only in moderation. In certain records, an overzealous cook who added too much garlic to a feast was quietly corrected, lest it disturb the moral or spiritual balance of the diners. Beans, particularly broad beans, were occasionally held responsible for both digestive and spiritual misfortunes. Pregnant women might be advised to avoid them, not because they were inherently harmful, but because they were thought to provoke undesirable physical reactions, which in turn could affect both mother and child. Even the slightest gastrointestinal discomfort could be interpreted as a moral failing or a symptom of imbalance, creating quiet anxiety in households and communities alike. Turnips and radishes, while seemingly innocuous, were also entangled in these gentle dramas. They were thought to stir minor passions or influence temperament, especially in women. Records suggest that overconsumption could be blamed for restlessness, minor illnesses, or even subtle social faux pas. The consequences were rarely dramatic. No one was exiled for eating a radish, but they were real, enough to affect everyday behavior. Families monitored meals, adjusted garden plots, and whispered advice, all in the name of health, morality, and propriety. Some cases verge on the absurd. There are accounts, faint but persistent, of minor noble families discouraging cucumber consumption during certain months, convinced that it could induce deformity in unborn children. Similarly, spinach, despite its otherwise benign nature, was sometimes avoided due to fears of mental weakness or spiritual distraction. These precautions might seem comical to us, yet they were sincere, deeply felt, and subtly enforced through social expectation. Even among monks and nuns, these vegetable concerns shaped daily life. One might imagine a quiet refectory, morning light filtering through stained glass, where a novice stirs soup and a senior nun inspects the leaves for moral propriety. The fear was never loud or dramatic, it was understated, pervasive, and influential. A single turnip, a clove of garlic, or a handful of beans could quietly structure meals, conversations, and the rhythm of domestic life. Interestingly, these vegetable anxieties were also intertwined with broader ideas about health, morality, and the body. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, suggested that foods influenced temperament and constitution. A hot or cold vegetable could throw off balance, leading to illness, irritability, or spiritual malaise. Thus, even a mundane dinner became a negotiation with both nature and belief. In some communities, the consequences extended beyond the household. Social events, communal feasts, and marketplaces all reflected these anxieties. A vendor might quietly hide forbidden vegetables behind other produce, careful to avoid offending community norms. Guests at a feast might nibble cautiously, aware of whispers and subtle guidance. Eating, in these moments, was not merely sustenance. It was a performance of prudence, decorum, and moral vigilance. These fears could even influence inheritance and lineage. Families concerned with producing strong, healthy heirs sometimes enforced strict dietary restrictions on women during pregnancy. A forbidden vegetable could be perceived as a threat to the continuity of noble lines or the future prosperity of the household. It is perhaps the quietest, yet most profound illustration of how a seemingly trivial plant could shape decisions of life, legacy, and social order. Yet, the story is not entirely tragic. There is gentle humor in imagining communities meticulously negotiating their relationship with vegetables. The noblewoman portioning cabbage with grave care, the monk measuring garlic with a pious eye, the child avoiding beans lest they cause social embarrassment. Of these moments are simultaneously poignant and lightly absurd. They remind us that human imagination can endow even the smallest objects with significance, turning roots and leaves into actors in a subtle drama of everyday life. And, in their quiet way, these restrictions reveal something universal: the desire to understand, predict, and control the uncertainties of life. Medieval people, lacking modern science, relied on observation, superstition, and social memory. Vegetables became symbolic touchstones for health, morality, and social harmony. Each carrot, turnip, or cucumber carried the weight of potential misfortune, guiding behavior with gentle, persistent influence. As you drift further into relaxation tonight, picture these quiet gardens, cloistered kitchens, and village feasts. Imagine the careful placement of forbidden vegetables, the subtle instructions whispered to novices and children, and the gentle, pervasive sense of watchfulness. Every leaf and root was part of a larger story of fear, care, morality, and human imagination. Next, we will continue with Part 6, exploring some of the rarest and most curious stories of vegetable bans and their effects, including tiny scandals, unexpected punishments, and the persistent anxiety that vegetables could cause. Because naturally, even the most innocuous root could inspire entire sagas of caution. Welcome back, friends. As your blankets cocoon you in quiet warmth, let us drift through the small, peculiar, and often amusing consequences that arose when medieval communities took their vegetable fears seriously. In this part, we explore the tiny scandals, whispered admonishments, and persistent anxieties that even humble plants could provoke. It is remarkable to consider that a carrot or parsnip could spark social tension. Take the case of a minor noblewoman in a small French town. She was quietly admonished by her family and household staff for serving too many turnips at a communal feast. The turnips, innocent in taste but morally suspect according to local custom, became a source of embarrassment. Guests whispered, midwives wagged fingers, and the noblewoman learned that even small culinary choices could ripple through social networks. Similarly, cucumbers, as we have seen, were sometimes blamed for deformities in unborn children. Pregnant women who consumed them were treated with gentle concern by family members and midwives. This concern could escalate to mild social censure if ignored, creating a small but persistent cloud of anxiety over what would otherwise be ordinary meals. Imagine the quiet tension in a kitchen as a woman slices cucumbers, aware that every cut might carry consequence. Beans, particularly broad beans, also played a subtle role in minor scandals. In some convents, a novice who accidentally ate too many beans might receive a gentle, knowing look from the abbess, or a whispered reminder of proper dietary restraint. These moments were never harsh or dramatic, but they conveyed the weight of communal expectation, morality, and propriety. Beans, in their quiet humility, became both sustenance and moral test. Garlic, paradoxically protective and dangerous, could also be the source of small domestic drama. In a monastery kitchen, too much garlic in a stew could provoke mild admonishment from senior monks, concerned less with health and more with the moral and spiritual atmosphere of the dining hall. One can imagine a cook measuring each clove carefully, aware that an extra bit might disrupt both digestion and decorum. The vegetable, completely unaware of its influence, continued to exist in quiet dignity. Cabbage, turnips, and leeks, of course, continued to occupy a precarious space. Families monitored their consumption, adjusting portions and timing with precision. A single misstep overindulging in cabbage during a sensitive period, for example, could lead to mild gossip, a gently wagging finger, or subtle commentary on prudence and obedience. These minor consequences were never life-altering, yet they reveal how even ordinary vegetables could carry weight far beyond their culinary value. In some villages, these anxieties escalated to curious communal practices. Certain vegetables were temporarily banned during festivals, feasts, or periods associated with fertility or spiritual observance. Market vendors adjusted their stalls accordingly, hiding carrots or beans from casual view. Households rationed forbidden vegetables or substituted safer options. The ordinary act of buying, preparing, or eating food became a negotiation with both social expectation and superstition. Pregnant women, in particular, bore the brunt of these vegetable anxieties. Midwives issued detailed guidance on what to avoid, often advising against parsnips, cucumbers, beans, or cabbage at critical times. Families followed these instructions with care, not out of fear of the vegetable itself, but out of concern for potential misfortune, deformity, or social embarrassment. The act of nourishing a child became intertwined with morality, superstition, and careful social observance. Even children were subtly educated in the moral weight of vegetables. A child might be warned not to eat too many turnips or beans lest they grow weak, morally lax, or socially awkward. These instructions were delivered gently, often as part of a broader effort to instill discipline, obedience, and attentiveness to communal norms. Food, in this sense, became a silent teacher of propriety and caution. It is fascinating to note that these anxieties often overlapped with humor, albeit quiet and understated. Imagine a small village whispering about the dangers of a single radish, or a nun carefully peeling a carrot while thinking about the potential consequences. The absurdity is gentle, almost imperceptible, and yet entirely real in the rhythm of daily life. Humans, as always, have a remarkable ability to imbue the ordinary with extraordinary significance. Sometimes, the consequences extended beyond social and domestic spheres into legal or quasi-legal regulation. While rare, there are records of temporary ordinances forbidding certain vegetables in markets or public gatherings. These restrictions were not enforced with severity, but the communal understanding of propriety ensured compliance. Merchants, aware of the collective anxiety, quietly adjusted their displays, and consumers navigated the subtle rules with care. A carrot in the wrong month could quietly disrupt the social order. The repetition of caution across multiple vegetables, cabbage, turnips, garlic, beans, cucumbers, leeks, created a pervasive but gentle structure of restraint. Every meal became an opportunity for mindfulness, every garden a stage for moral reflection. The ordinary act of eating, preparing, or planting vegetables was subtly elevated into a meditation on balance, propriety, and social harmony. And yet, the vegetables themselves remained unremarkable. They were merely roots and leaves, entirely innocent, quietly witnessing the anxieties, fears, and minor dramas of the human communities around them. Carrots did not conspire, turnips did not plot, and cabbages certainly did not judge. And perhaps this is part of the charm. The humble, harmless vegetable, elevated by human imagination into something far weightier than its taste or texture. So tonight, as you drift further into calm drowsiness, picture these quiet kitchens, gardens, and marketplaces. Imagine the careful placement of forbidden vegetables, the gentle admonishments whispered in kitchens, the mild social ripples caused by Each leaf and root carries a story not of drama or horror, but of caution, prudence, and the gentle absurdity of human imagination. In the next part we will conclude this meandering journey by reflecting on the enduring legacy of these vegetable anxieties, the subtle humor in their consequences, and the quiet reminder that even the most ordinary objects can shape daily life in remarkable ways. Because, naturally, humans have a way of taking the simplest things very seriously. Welcome back, friends. As you nestle deeper into your blankets and the night grows still, let us slowly close our journey through the curious world of medieval vegetable bans. Tonight, we reflect on the stories, anxieties, and gentle absurdities that humble roots and leaves inspired across centuries. By now, you may have noticed a pattern. Even the most ordinary vegetable could carry extraordinary weight. Cabbages could signify spiritual imbalance. Parsnips could symbolize temptation, beans could provoke mild scandal. And yet, these were not tales of dramatic villainy or terror. They were subtle, pervasive, and quietly influential. In medieval Europe, the ordinary was never entirely ordinary. Every meal, every garden, every harvest was an opportunity for careful negotiation with both superstition and social expectation. Consider the social dimension. Communities monitored consumption, offered gentle guidance, and sometimes whispered admonitions when rules were transgressed. A carrot could quietly shape behavior, a cucumber could inspire caution, and a radish could subtly affect reputation. These were minor, almost imperceptible consequences, yet they reveal something deeply human, our desire to impose order on uncertainty. Vegetables became a lens through which people managed fear, morality, and propriety. At the same time, there is a certain humor in these practices, if observed with gentle distance. Imagine a noblewoman carefully slicing cabbage, aware of its moral weight. Picture a monk measuring garlic with pious precision. Visualize a child avoiding beans, concerned about invisible consequences. The absurdity is soft, understated, and entirely human. It's not the loud, theatrical humor of a stage performance, but the quiet, persistent comedy of life itself. The medical theories of the time there, for humors, the belief in hot, cold, wet, and dry foods add complexity to every garden and kitchen. A leek could be warming, a cucumber cooling, and every combination of vegetables carried implications for body, mind, and spirit. This delicate calculus turned even simple meals into exercises in vigilance, self-control, and reflection. Eating was never merely nourishment. It was an intimate engagement with belief, caution, and social expectation. And yet, despite the rules, the whispers, and the occasional minor scandal, life continued. Families gardened, nuns and monks tended their cloisters, children grew up observing the gentle anxieties surrounding food, and communities persisted in their quiet rhythms. Vegetables remained humble, passive, and entirely unaware of the weight humanity bestowed upon them. They nourished, provoked thought, and occasionally inspired quiet social correction, but they never complained. In this, there is something comforting. While medieval people assigned moral, spiritual, and social significance to their vegetables, we can observe these practices from a distance, appreciating both the diligence and the gentle absurdity. There is a rhythm to it, the caution, the observation, the minor admonishments, the small celebrations when rules were followed. It's a portrait of human care, imagination, and the sometimes quirky ways we navigate uncertainty. As you drift further toward sleep, imagine the gardens once again, rows of cabbages, turnips, parsnips, beans, and cucumbers. Quiet kitchens, where novices, cooks, and housewives carefully prepare meals with moral and spiritual mindfulness. Marketplaces where vendors discreetly arrange their produce, mindful of both taste and propriety. Children learning early that even ordinary plants can carry weighty significance. The scene is gentle, repetitive, and soothing, full of small, quiet dramas that never erupt into chaos. In the end, these stories remind us of the subtle ways humans engage with the world around them. Fear, imagination, morality, and care intertwined, shaping behavior, meals, gardens, and social life. And while the specifics may seem quaint or absurd to us today, the underlying human impulse is timeless. The desire to understand, to guide, and to navigate the uncertainties of existence even through something as small and humble as a vegetable. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy, allow yourself to drift into the calm rhythm of history. Let the quiet absurdity of cabbages, beans, garlic, and cucumbers carry you gently into sleep. Picture the gardens, the kitchens, the cautious feasts, and the mild admonishments. Let these stories of minor anxieties, humble vegetables, and quiet vigilance soothe you, because in the end, history is not only about grand events, battles, or kings. It is about the small, ordinary, and sometimes absurd details that shape everyday life. Rest now, with the gentle hum of medieval gardens and whispered caution lingering softly in your mind. And tomorrow or the next time you wander through your own kitchen, remember that even the most ordinary object can hold a story, quietly significant, quietly human, and quietly soothing. Good night, friends. Welcome back, friends. Tonight, as you sink deeper into your blankets and the world outside softens into quiet shadows, we drift into a different kind of enclosure, the medieval convent. These were spaces of devotion, discipline, and daily ritual. Yet behind the carefully maintained walls, within the cloistered gardens and candlelit corridors, human desire and social curiosity quietly persisted. Convents were, in theory, havens of piety and moral perfection. Nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, contemplation, and service. Meals were simple, work was regimented, and interactions with the outside world were strictly controlled. And yet, humans being humans, subtle relationships and attachments often flourished in ways that were never intended by abbesses or spiritual authorities. Perhaps the most striking aspect of convent life was its combination of strict supervision and intimate proximity. Nuns shared rooms, worked side by side in gardens and kitchens, and attended the same prayers hour after hour. This closeness, combined with limited exposure to men and the outside world, created an environment where subtle friendships could deepen into more complex attachments. Sometimes, these attachments remained innocent, gentle, and comforting. Other times, they became the source of whispered rumors, mild scandal, or quiet admonishment. The term forbidden relationships in this context rarely refers to anything dramatic by modern standards. It was often about emotional closeness that crossed lines of strict decorum. Private notes exchanged between nuns, hands held during work, secret walks in the garden, or whispered conversations in dormitories. These acts, seemingly trivial, could be interpreted as morally questionable, particularly by abbesses or visiting clergy. Some convent records suggest that certain pairs of nuns were repeatedly admonished for excessive familiarity. One might imagine a senior nun quietly observing two novices, noting that they laughed too often together, lingered in the garden, or shared confidences beyond what was considered appropriate. The reprimands were gentle, often delivered as moral guidance rather than punishment. Yet the awareness of scrutiny shaped daily life in subtle ways. The psychological dimension of these relationships is also fascinating. Convent life was structured, repetitive, and often isolated from broader social experience. Emotional attachments offered comfort, companionship, and support in a world that demanded constant discipline. In this sense, what might be considered forbidden was also human, natural, and perhaps inevitable. Nuns sought warmth, intimacy, and understanding, even within the strictest of boundaries. Occasionally, letters or diaries reveal more overt expressions of attachment. A nun might describe her longing to be near a particular sister, or her delight in a shared secret, or her subtle jealousy when attention was directed elsewhere. These writings, always careful to remain within acceptable bounds, hint at the intensity of emotional life behind convent walls. They are, in a quiet way, among the most human and relatable documents of the period. Abbesses and spiritual guides approached these relationships with both care and caution. On one hand, they recognized the value of companionship for morale and mental health. On the other hand, they sought to prevent attachments from undermining discipline, spiritual focus, or social harmony. The tension was subtle, guidance rather than punishment, gentle redirection rather than dramatic intervention. A soft word here, a carefully chosen task there, and the attachment could be contained without overt conflict. Human desire also intersected with mundane concerns. Nuns were often young women who had entered the convent at an early age, sometimes under family pressure, sometimes voluntarily. Within this enclosed world, emotional energy naturally sought outlets. Friendships, mentorships, and even mild romantic inclinations provided distraction, comfort, and personal satisfaction. Sometimes, these bonds were encouraged for practical purposes, such as pairing novices for work or study. Other times, they were discouraged when perceived as distractions from prayer or communal duty. Interestingly, some convents developed their own subtle rules and social norms to manage these dynamics. For example, certain walks or chores might be assigned to ensure balance, supervision, and separation when necessary. Dormitory arrangements were designed not only for practicality, but also for moral oversight. Even the placement of windows, garden paths, and communal spaces played a role in shaping behavior. Human desire, though quiet, was never entirely beyond observation. And yet, despite all supervision, these relationships persisted. Small gestures, gentle exchanges, and emotional bonds quietly thrived. Nuns found ways to navigate rules, maintain friendship, and satisfy their human need for connection without overtly violating convent norms. There is a quiet ingenuity, a subtle balancing act of emotion, obedience, and discretion that defines much of convent life. Some of these stories verge on the tragic, though gently so. A nun might be reassigned or moved to a different dormitory to prevent undue closeness. Correspondence might be censored or guided. Friendships, intensely cherished, could be limited by the necessity of obedience. The consequences were rarely dramatic. but they created subtle undercurrents of longing, adaptation, and quiet resilience, and sometimes the consequences were mildly absurd. Accounts exist of nuns whispering in gardens, giggling at minor jokes, or exchanging flowers, only to be admonished for excessive intimacy. These moments, though trivial, demonstrate how deeply human connection was constrained by the structures of discipline, devotion, and social expectation. It's a soft, slightly ironic reminder that human nature rarely conforms entirely to rules, no matter how carefully constructed. In a few rare cases, convent relationships intersected with the outside world. A visiting cleric might notice attachments, or families might comment on the unusual closeness of two nuns. These interactions were generally quiet, managed with discretion, and rarely escalated. The convent, after all, was designed to maintain both order and the appearance of moral rectitude. Yet, beneath the surface, life continued in all its gentle, human complexity. As you drift further into calm, imagine the convent gardens at dusk. Rows of herbs and vegetables, quiet corridors, candlelit chapels, and cloistered courtyards. Nuns walking slowly, chatting softly, sharing secret smiles or gestures of comfort. A world structured, disciplined, and quietly alive with emotion. The intimacy is gentle, the potential for scandal subdued, and the human need for connection subtly evident everywhere. And so, tonight, we leave the convent behind with a gentle understanding that human emotion, desire, and friendship persist even in the strictest environments. Bonds form, flourish, and sometimes bend the rules quietly, without drama or spectacle. The story is not one of scandal or tragedy, but of ordinary human connections, soft, persistent, and profoundly human. In the next part, we may explore the consequences of these relationships when combined with societal pressures, moral scrutiny, and the occasional minor transgressional, still gently, quietly, and sleepily, of course. Welcome back, friends. As your blankets fold around you and the night grows still, let us continue our gentle exploration of life within medieval convents. Beyond emotional bonds and subtle friendships, there existed small, often unnoticed, transgressions, quiet breaches of rules, minor indulgences, and the soft consequences that followed. Convent life was highly structured. The day began with prayers, work, meals, and study, punctuated by precise schedules for chores, reading, and meditation. Yet within this disciplined routine, nuns sometimes found ways to bend rules in the smallest of ways. A clandestine smile, a whispered conversation, or a shared glance could be considered a minor transgression, enough to attract quiet admonishment from a supervising abbess. The consequences of these small breaches were rarely dramatic. A gentle word here, a reassignment of duties there, a discreet separation of companions, these were the standard responses. Nuns internalized the rules, adjusted behavior, and continued to live their lives quietly, finding ways to satisfy emotional needs without overtly violating the strict codes of conduct. The subtlety of the discipline is remarkable. Enforcement relied less on punishment than on psychological awareness, social expectation, and moral persuasion. Sometimes, the transgressions were as simple as minor indulgences in food or leisure. A nun might secretly nibble a forbidden treat, linger in a sunlit garden beyond her assigned hour, or read a secular book tucked away in the corner of the library. These acts, minor by design, were quietly observed or reported, and the response was usually a soft, corrective intervention. There was no dramatic scandal, no public reprimand, just a gentle realignment with convent norms. Emotional transgressions were equally subtle. A novice might show favoritism toward a companion, take a slightly longer walk in the cloister, or exchange small tokens of affection. These gestures were carefully monitored, sometimes encouraged for the sake of morale, sometimes discouraged to maintain discipline. The boundaries were fluid, and nuns learned to navigate them with quiet ingenuity. It is, in many ways, a testament to human adaptability, finding emotional satisfaction within the tightest constraints. In some cases, the social consequences extended beyond the convent walls. Visiting clergy, family members, or patrons might notice unusual closeness or particular attachments and raise gentle concerns. The convent responded with discretion, careful reassignment of tasks, private counseling, or subtle reinforcement of communal rules. There were no dramatic expulsions for minor transgressions. Instead, life continued, gently recalibrated. Interestingly, some records hint at the creative strategies nuns employed to maintain friendships or attachments without attracting undue attention. A shared prayer, an exchanged book, or the subtle arrangement of chores allowed them to preserve emotional bonds while remaining within the letter of the rules. These acts are quietly ingenious, a form of social and emotional negotiation that required patience, subtlety, and observation. The rhythm of convent life amplified the significance of these minor gestures. In a world where every day was highly regimented, even small deviations could carry weight. A hand lingered too long, a glance held too meaningfully, or a whispered conversation in the garden could provoke awareness, admonishment, or gentle correction. And yet, within this structure, human nature persisted. Attachment, curiosity, and emotional intimacy found ways to flourish. It is worth noting that these transgressions were rarely scandalous in the modern sense. There was no shouting, no punishment beyond gentle guidance, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, life moved forward with quiet reflection, subtle correction, and the soft maintenance of moral and social order. The convent became both a stage and a laboratory for observing human behavior under constraints, disciplined, orderly, yet quietly human. The small dramas of convent life were mirrored in the mundane. Meals, chores, study, and prayer were all arenas where rules could be bent or stretched. A shared task in the kitchen, a garden assignment, or a pair of nuns reading together could carry layers of emotional meaning. The ordinary became subtly charged, every action potentially a moral or social consideration. And yet, this tension was gentle, understated, and entirely manageable within the rhythm of daily life. From the outside, the life of a convent might seem austere, rigid, or monolithic, but the internal landscape was quietly complex. Emotions, attachments, and minor indulgences existed alongside strict devotion. Nuns learned to negotiate desires, maintain friendships, and comply with rules, all while navigating the subtle social pressures imposed by abbesses, peers, and tradition. It was, in a way, a delicate dance, performed daily, with grace and attention. As you drift further into drowsiness, imagine the quiet corridors and candlelit chapels. Picture the careful allocation of duties, the soft whisper of voices in a garden, the subtle exchanges of kindness or friendship. Every gesture carries quiet meaning. Every glance hints at human warmth, and every minor transgression reflects the persistent ingenuity of the human heart. Ultimately, life in the convent demonstrates that even in the most disciplined, structured environments, human nature adapts, persists, and finds ways to express itself. The minor transgressions, emotional bonds, and subtle negotiations are not failures. They are a testament to the quiet resilience, intelligence, and ingenuity of people living under constraint. Tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier, picture these small, soft dramas unfolding slowly, almost imperceptibly, behind convent walls. They are gentle reminders that human connection, curiosity, and subtle rebellion persist quietly, even in the most controlled environments. And in this quiet persistence, there is both charm and comfort, a reminder of the enduring complexity of human life, even in its softest, smallest details. In the next part, we will explore the intersection of these relationships with rules of morality, oversight by abbesses, and the occasional intrusion of the outside world, all with the same calm, soothing narration suitable for sleep. Welcome back, friends. As you sink deeper into your blankets and the night grows still, we arrive at the quiet conclusion of our journey inside medieval convents. We've wandered through gardens, cloisters, and candlelit corridors, observing the gentle drama of friendships, attachments, and minor transgressions. Tonight, we consider how morality, oversight, and subtle rules shaped this unique world. Convents were, first and foremost, spaces of discipline and devotion. Abbesses and senior nuns guided daily life, ensuring that prayer, study, and work remained the primary focus. They were attentive, perceptive, and patient, aware that the heart has a way of quietly bending even the strictest rules. Their oversight was never harsh but persistent, a constant gentle presence reminding everyone of communal and spiritual expectations. Morality was embedded not only in doctrine but in the rhythm of daily life. Each hour of prayer, each chore, each shared meal was an opportunity to cultivate virtue. And yet, within these routines, human nature quietly persisted. Nuns formed attachments, shared confidences, and expressed affection in subtle, gentle ways. These relationships were rarely scandalous, but they required careful navigation to remain within acceptable bounds. When minor transgressions occurred, a whispered conversation, a shared smile, an exchanged tokenly response was usually quiet and corrective rather than punitive. Abbesses might reassign duties, offer private counsel, or adjust sleeping arrangements. Friends were gently separated when necessary, yet the bonds themselves were rarely broken. Emotional life persisted, adapted, and found equilibrium within the framework of discipline. External influences sometimes added complexity. Visiting clergy, families, and patrons occasionally noticed unusual closeness or attachment. These observations prompted mild intervention, guidance, reassurance, or subtle adjustment of roles. Yet the convent maintained its calm, self-contained rhythm. The world outside could intrude, but rarely with dramatic force. Inside, life continued, gently structured, quietly human. It is remarkable how subtly human connection wove itself into the fabric of convent life. Emotional bonds, friendships, and even minor flirtations persisted quietly, without disrupting devotion or discipline. Nuns learned the art of balancing desire and duty, friendship and obedience, personal need and communal expectation. The result was a nuanced, complex, and deeply human environment, structured yet flexible, disciplined yet alive with quiet emotion. There is a certain beauty in this subtlety. The world behind convent walls was governed by rules, rituals, and oversight, yet the small dramas of attachment, longing, and companionship continued. A glance in the garden, a shared task in the kitchen, a whispered encouragement, all these acts revealed the quiet ingenuity and resilience of human emotion. Discipline did not extinguish feeling. It shaped it, guided it, and allowed it to exist in refined, understated ways. The minor transgressions, gentle admonishments, and emotional negotiations reveal something timeless: the persistence of human connection. Even in the strictest, most regulated environments, people find ways to care, to bond, and to express affection. Life inside a convent may have been regimented, but it was never devoid of warmth, curiosity, or subtle intimacy. And so, tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the convent one last time. Cloistered gardens bathed in soft light, quiet corridors echoing with footsteps, and small gestures of companionship unfolding gently. Observe the subtle social dances, the tiny acts of kindness, and the quiet resilience of human hearts. Even under strict oversight, affection persists. Even under discipline, warmth endures. Even within rules, the human spirit finds a way. In the end, the story of forbidden relationships in medieval convents is not one of scandal or drama, but of ordinary humanity. It is about subtle ingenuity, gentle compromise, and the quiet persistence of emotion. It reminds us that even in the most structured environments, life finds a way to express itself softly, persistently, and beautifully. So tonight, rest with the knowledge that human connection is enduring, even under constraint. Let the calm rhythm of convent life, the gentle oversight, the whispered confidences, the quiet bonds carry you into deep, soothing sleep. The stories of these walls are not of punishment, fear, or shame, but of patience, care, and the delicate persistence of the human heart. Good night, friends. Let the quietude of history soothe you into gentle dreams.